no. It's okay. Okay, we are in Deuteronomy 23. Now this is going to be about people that are excluded from the assembly of God. But as we go through history, there are going to be times in the future where some of these regulations are relaxed for certain people. This is the law for Moses at the time. So, I will just take the fun verse 1. No one whose testicles are crushed or whose male organ is cut off shall enter the assembly of the Lord. Now you know why I didn't want to do this on Christmas Day or Christmas Eve. It is not a good Christmas Eve subject. So, do you need to come by?
Can I?
Yes, of course.
My translation says emasculated.
Emasculated. Another word for castration. It doesn't matter how the castration happened. It could be a birth defect, could be an accident, or it could be someone forced to be a eunuch. So any man without male parts, the right male parts, was not allowed to be in the assembly of God. Now, if it was an accident, doesn't that seem unfair?
Yes, it does. It does.
Now, Matthew Poole thinks that the assembly of the Lord for this means in the leadership, or the rulers, which seems less unfair. Not that these men were barred from religious life, but just from being the leaders.
Oh.
But that's Matthew Poole. Others say, it's just the way it is. Isaiah 56:3 says that eunuchs would be acceptable to the Lord if they obey. So by the time Isaiah comes around, eunuchs are accepted into fellowship. So if this means they're not accepted in fellowship here, this is one of the ones that is going to get relaxed later. Most feel that what it means is they aren't allowed to be involved in worship. That's the part that seems unfair.
Yeah.
But the idea, part of the idea could be that for Israel and for God, human life was sacred. And a male that couldn't produce children couldn't contribute to that. Something like the image of God, and they don't have the image of God. Now, most castrated men were because they were made into eunuchs. So it was not an accidental thing for most. And most of the time it was for a pagan ceremony. So it's very much discouraging creating eunuchs like the pagans do. Later, it's going to translate in the New Testament to what Revelation 22:17 says. Whosoever will let him take the water of life freely. It becomes an exclusion to anyone that accepts his lordship. So does that mean that the God of the Old Testament is different from the God of the New Testament? Lots of critics of God say so. But God is the same yesterday, today, forever. He had a reason. This seems to be to exclude pagan rites. Is to discourage anyone from becoming a eunuch. If you become a eunuch, you're out of our fellowship. But exclusion from the worship service didn't exclude anyone from believing in God and obeying God. So, that is pretty much all I could find on this, and all I wanted to find on this. So, okay, let's go to verse 2. Elaine, I'm going to start this way.
Okay, verse 2.
Yes.
One of illegitimate birth shall not enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of his descendants shall enter the assembly of the Lord.
Now, that seems like another unfair one. There's different thoughts on who this is referring to. Some later Jewish writers say this is someone who was born of an incestuous relationship between Jews. And mine, by the way, says forbidden union. Others say it's children of a mixed marriage between Jews and pagans. Others say it means the children of prostitutes born at pagan cult sites. Whenever you see the phrase "to the 10th generation," it's really a saying meaning forever. It's not like they would count 10 generations and, okay, now you can come. It would mean forever. But whatever it is, and you can see there is so much disagreement on who this refers to, it's basically a deterrent from marrying the wrong person and having the wrong kind of a relationship. God wanted a core marriage between Hebrews, between Israelites. He didn't want the pagans mixed in there. He wanted two Israelites to marry and have Israelite babies. So if you didn't, your children were excluded from the service worship. Okay, and again, that was needed.
The point in saying it's unfair, we need to make sure that we're realizing it's not God that's being unfair. It's us being unfair to future generations.
Right.
We're allowing, because he's giving us this order, and let's say a man and a woman go out and have a child out of wedlock or unforbidden, it's not the child's fault, you're right, it's the parents. It's not God's fault either. He's giving us these orders and we're choosing not to follow them, so it's our fault, not his.
I'm glad you're bringing that up, because
It's not
what it
him
is,
being
it's
unfair.
the consequences of your sin.
Because you can't allow sin, and by letting them in,
Yeah.
it's almost like he's condoning that
Exactly.
behavior. And
Yeah.
he's not.
Because
So
it's
then
not,
you need to be looking at the parent
Yeah.
and being like, okay, that's not right.
yeah.
But
So
not
many of
being
these
upset
are
with God.
meant to be aimed at the
Deterrence from
parents to say, don't don't
Yeah.
do these kind of things, or you're going to bring this on your children.
Yeah.
So
Well, that makes me feel better.
yeah,
I mean, it's
Yeah,
not
so I'm glad
God
you said
that's
that.
being,
Right.
yeah,
you have to look at it. It's the parent.
Yeah.
Because they
Yeah.
were given an order and they chose to disobey.
Right.
And now their child has to suffer their consequences.
Right.
yeah.
But
Because
it's not God.
if we had followed what God had wanted,
None of it would
we
be
would be
happening.
in the Garden of Eden.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. So
Oh, that makes me.
this is all because of sin on earth. Okay, let's look at the next group of people that aren't allowed in. Verses 3 through 6.
No Ammonite or Moabite or any of his descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, even down to the 10th generation. For they did not come to meet you with bread and water on your way when you came out of Egypt. And they hired Balaam, son of Beor, from Pethor in Aram Naharaim, to pronounce a curse on you. However, the Lord your God would not listen to Balaam, but turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loves you. Do not seek a treaty of the friendship with them as long as you live.
Okay, so we're going back in their history of the travel, and when they wanted to go through the Ammonite and Moabite land, they said no, and they hired Balaam to come put a curse on them, and so God says they're not allowed. They didn't play nice. They're not allowed. They refused you. Both of these people groups are not considered Canaanites. They lived outside of Canaan. They lived on the east side of the Jordan River. And both of these peoples were descended from the daughters of Lot. So they're distant relatives. And it may seem like God is against certain races of people in this, but what God is against is these people had a heart against his people. And there's that 10th generation thing again, meaning forever. So what about Ruth? She's a Moabitess. She's from Moab. Here's another example of in the future there will be exclusions. God looks at the heart. She said, your people will be my people. She adopted the people. One commentary said, well, it's because this only applies to men. But that's only one person that said that. Verse 5 tells us why God turned Balaam's curse into a blessing. It was because he loved them, the Israelites. Verse 6 says, don't make peace treaties with these guys either. So that's something to look for in the future, to see if they make any peace treaties with these guys when we get into Judges, Joshua and Judges. Okay, verse 7 and 8.
You shall, excuse me, you shall not abhor an Amalek.
Yeah, we've all had throat things.
Yeah. For he is your brother. You shall not abhor an Egyptian, because you were an alien in his land. The children of the third generation born to them may enter the assembly of the Lord.
Okay, notice this one is not to the 10th generation thing. So Edomites, they were more closely related to the Hebrews. They were descended from Esau, Jacob's brother. So kind of like cousins. Now, one of the most famous Edomites in history, we've talked about before, he is hated by the Jews when he comes along, and that's Herod the Great. He was an Edomite. Yeah. Later in history, the Jews are going to conquer the Edomites, and they're going to subject them, and they're going to force them to become Jews. So, along comes Herod. A few generations later, he's a Jewish Edomite, but only because they forced him to be a Jew. The Jews looked on him as a half-Jew, and they hated him. They didn't feel like he was one of them, and he ends up ruling over them, so they hate him. So, isn't the Egyptian thing kind of interesting? You shouldn't hate the Egyptians, even though they enslaved you for 400 years and didn't treat you well. But God says it's because you were guests for 400 years. Don't treat your guests that way, though.
Well, at first they were treated nicely.
They were treated great when Joseph was around, and for several generations, and it degraded into where it. So not all 400 years were
And you
sacred.
see that God is just, and God is just, so.
Yeah. God has a purpose for the Egyptians. He had a purpose for the family, the Hebrews, to go into Egypt. They went in as a family, and they came out as a nation because they were in Egypt. So after 3 generations, they're allowed to come into the assembly. Again, good morning. We don't know if that means to worship with them or to be a leader, to be in their leadership. 3 generations gives you time to fully integrate into Israeli society. So, Okay, so Vicky, this looks on verse 9 through 14.
When you are encamped against your enemies, be careful to avoid anything offensive. If there is a man among you who is unclean because of his bodily emission during the night, he must go outside the camp. He may not come anywhere inside the camp. When evening approaches, he must wash with water, and when the sun sets, he may come inside the camp. You must have a place outside the camp and go there to relieve yourself. You must have a digging tool in your equipment. When you relieve yourself, dig a hole with it and cover up your excrement. For the Lord your God walks throughout your camp to protect you and deliver your enemies to you. So your encampments must be holy. He must not say anything improper among you, or he will turn away from you.
Isn't this another nice subject?
Yes.
Start off with crushed testicles and go on to, yeah.
Why
Bodily
do you even
functions.
need to say that?
Isn't it amazing the detail that God cares about?
Yes. Who would have thought?
Yeah, he cares about everything, including this.
That is
Yeah, do something with it, right?
This is talking about army camp life. Even though they're out, when they go out fighting, and they're going to be going out fighting a lot, God wanted cleanliness.
Sanitation. I mean,
Yeah.
makes
Right.
sense.
Now, it's different from everybody else around them, but God took care of, God knew what was healthy, and he wanted his people to be healthy. Now, what the nocturnal emissions specifically are, don't know. I don't even want to conjecture. It's basically anything that comes from the body. Was
If you have the stomach
unclean.
bug, you better run out of that camp and be ready.
yeah.
If you have diarrhea, anything, you better get outside that camp. And whatever it was, afterward they had to ceremonially clean themselves, and then they could come back into the camp. Some say it's kind of a latrine area, which again, that would be unusual for the pagans. Didn't do that. They just
Yeah. I was going to say, some camps don't do that today.
yeah. And it seems like it makes sense to us,
Yeah.
but it would be way different from everybody else around them.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody else would probably be going, "Oh, why are you doing that?"
Right.
But again, they didn't have the diseases that everyone else
Yep.
had because they were so clean.
Yeah,
Clean, right?
exactly. The Hebrew word for excrement is what comes from you. So, now it's not saying that there's any sinful thing about your body functions, but again, God was concerned about sanitation. They had to carry a shovel around to bury their refuse. That's different. It kept their camp clean and sanitary. And besides the sanitary, the reason for all this to stay clean is because God walks among them. You don't want God walking.
No.
Yeah. God walks among our churches. He wants to see a holy people. He wants us to keep the unclean things out. Now, of course, we accept unclean people in because that's who God came for. But the unclean things in our lives, they don't belong in a church. And a church is us, the people, not just the building. So even in your most private moments, God is with you. Sometimes kind of sobering to think when you're on your throne, God's there. and he's looking at your behavior. Now, in the future, the rabbis are going to teach that the city of Jerusalem is the camp of God. And for that reason, you had to go outside the camp to relieve yourself. Jerusalem was not a tiny city by the time the rabbis say this. So can you imagine having to relieve yourself and get outside those city walls? And especially on a Sunday with the travel limits and, you know, how do you balance all that? It was, so therefore the rabbis said, you just can't relieve yourself on the Sabbath day.
No.
Because you have to travel too far. And so you'd break the Sabbath, so.
Oh.
Yeah. So that is taking things way out of context. That's not what God said. It's the camp. So I can't even imagine in a camp having to go out. But it was sanitary. So he was taking care of the people. Yeah. I think we may be done with the really gross stuff. But again, God is concerned about every little detail of our life.
But when we were talking about food, they also were very much precise what to eat.
Mm-hmm. God was taking care of his people. Okay, 15 and 16.
If a slave has taken refuge with you, do not hand him over to his master. Let him live among you wherever he likes and in whatever town he chooses. Do not oppress him.
Okay, so this is not about an Israelite slave, which in 7 years they would have to, every 7 years they'd have to free all the slaves and things anyway. This is about a slave escaping from a foreign land into your land. You didn't send them back. They were free. Kind of like the Underground Railroad. Once they reached a certain place, they were free. Now, other cultures demanded that slaves be returned and they would kill them. But Israel was to allow them to live in the land. This is a reminder that they were once slaves and are now free. So, receive these that were once slaves, and they're free too. Verse 17 and 18. What are you, Volpos?
Oh, I'm sorry. 17 and 18.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, short.
No Israelite man or woman is to become a shrine prostitute. You must not bring the earnings of a female prostitute or of a male prostitute into the house of the Lord your God to pray any vow, because the Lord your God detests them both.
Okay. God wanted to make it clear. What other nations do, you will not do. Other nations had cult prostitutes. Could you imagine going to church and meeting up with your prostitute, male or female? Much later, during the reigns of Asa and Josiah, we're told that male prostitutes were expelled from Israel. So they were there. How does God feel about these cult prostitutes? They're an abomination. That is a strong, strong word. God never wants money from a prostitute, from the act of prostitution. Now, other cultures, that's how they made a lot of money. But God doesn't want from ill-gotten gains. Is that still true today? I would think so too. But he doesn't want you to go, well, he doesn't want you to take your tithe and go to Vegas and triple it. He wants money from he doesn't need your money. He wants your heart.
I want you to want to do it.
Yeah. And if your heart is in doing sin to get this money, he doesn't want that. So he cares about the source, because he cares about how do you get that money. If you're a businessman and you're cheating everybody, he doesn't want that money either. He wants you to restore it back to the people you cheated. And then tithe from your heart. Most important part is always from your heart. He wants a joyful giver. Okay, let's look at 19 and 20.
You shall not charge interest on loans to your brother, interest on money, interest on food, interest on anything that is lent for interest. You may charge a foreigner interest, but you may not charge your brother interest. The Lord your God may bless you in all that you undertake in the land that you are entering, and take possession of it.
Do you get the feeling God doesn't want you to charge interest to your brothers? I mean, how many times did he say interest in there? Don't, and interest on food. I remember when grocery stores first started taking credit cards for food, for groceries. And I thought, you're going to have to pay interest on your food now. And God says, but God's saying, don't charge interest to your fellow Israelites. Lend them things, but don't charge interest. You can charge all the interest you want to everybody else, to foreigners. But to fellow Israelites, no interest. And some say that it mentions the food because it's talking about don't charge interest for the basic needs of your brother and sister. Because food is a basic need. So, there's a statement there. I don't understand why I wrote it, so I'm not going to say it. Verse 21 through 23.
Do you want to save the long ones for me?
No, that's not nearly as long as...
Oh, good. Not a weird one again. If you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay fulfilling it. For the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and you will be guilty of sin. But if you refrain from vowing, you will not be guilty of sin. You shall be careful to do what has passed from your lips, for you have voluntarily vowed to the Lord your God what you have promised with your mouth.
Okay, so we've seen this before. Vows are not a small thing. It's a sin not to fulfill a vow to God. And in fact, the New Testament says, don't take vows at all. Just your word should be good enough. You shouldn't have to take vows. But we do take vows today. We vow to pay our car payment. That's a vow. Your house payment.
What about New Year's resolutions?
Yeah, good question.
If it's a vow, don't do it lightly.
Do it.
Yeah. Be careful with those resolutions, because everyone, we know resolutions are kind of a joke because you make them and then break them. But if it's a vow, God says don't do it lightly. So oaths are not forbidden. Jesus answered an oath in court, and God himself swears oaths. So it's okay to make an oath, which an oath and a vow, I'm not sure how they're different. But again, take them seriously. If you make an oath, it's serious. It shouldn't be necessary other than legal contracts. It shouldn't be necessary to take an oath because our word should be good. We should just be able to say it and people know it's the truth. But again, it's stressed, if you make a vow, keep it. Don't make foolish vows. Some vows are just foolish vows. Don't, just be careful with vows, is what God's saying. And the, can't remember if it's Pharisees or Sadducees. They become famous for taking vows that are just crazy vows. And if you swear on this, it's one thing, but if you swear on this, it really doesn't mean anything. It's like crossing your fingers behind your back. So, yeah.
Little childs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like if you swear on the altar, it meant something, but if you swear on the chalice on the altar, it didn't mean anything. So, and the Pharisees or Sadducees, again, I don't remember which one, they knew what was the right thing and the wrong thing, but no one else did. So they could swear all these things and everyone would believe them, and they're crossing their fingers.
It's like people nowadays, you have to believe me, I swear on my grandmother's grave. Why do you do that?
Yeah.
There's no point.
Yeah. Okay, verse 24 and 25. Miss Betty.
Okay. 24 and 25. I look up. Okay. When you enter your neighbor's vineyard, then you may eat grapes until you are fully satisfied, but you shall not put any in your basket. When you enter your neighbor's standing grain, then you may pluck the heads from your hand, but you shall not wield a sickle in your neighbor's standing grain.
Okay, so if you were traveling, it was okay to go through someone's fields and pick enough to eat along the way. Just don't bring your basket and sickle and everything else to gather things. Just enough to eat. That's what Jesus and his disciples were doing as they were traveling through the field and they got in trouble.
On a Sunday, on a Sabbath.
Yeah, they didn't get in trouble for picking grain.
Mm-hmm.
They got in trouble for picking it on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
And you could eat as much as you want. So you could just walk really slowly and pick things. And, there wasn't any limit on how many times you could go back. This was a way to take care of the poor or the traveler. So you could eat all you want, but no doggy bags. And, yep. Okay, wow, we got through a whole chapter. And these are the various laws. And in the middle of chapter 24, we're going to get to where it's just law after law after law that seem unrelated. But they're all the various laws. Again, God cares so much about every detail of their life because they are setting up a whole country. But he cares about every detail of our lives too. Okay, so let's see what 24 has for us. Verses 1, just 1.
Okay. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house.
In the middle of a sentence. An important thing to know about these verses about divorce. They are about a specific type of incident. God is not condoning divorce. In the New Testament, we'll see that Jesus says Moses allowed divorce because God knew your hearts and knew you were going to divorce anyway, so he's regulating it. So it's just not running rampant. Because one of the things about the nations around them, they would divorce and remarry and divorce and remarry and divorce and remarry, go back to the first husband and remarry. They had no commitment. And that is not what God wanted. He wanted a relationship between a husband and a wife. According to some of the theologians, men were divorcing their wives so they could have a weekend fling. And then they'd taken them back again because their laundry got dirty.
Yeah.
they needed regulations. It wasn't divorce at will. There had to be cause. Even with cause, it wasn't supposed to be an easy option. It was supposed to be taken seriously. The Hebrew idea of divorce was kind of like cutting off a part of your body. It was supposed to feel like you were losing a part of your body. Now, when it says, if then she finds no favor in his eyes, that means, in Hebrew, it means he really hates her. Really, really hates her. And so he wants to divorce her.
But why do it anyway? Why
not just go have a fling?
No. I mean, why does he marry her to begin with?
Well, maybe he fell out of love with her, or maybe it was to get her dowry or land, or don't know. So a certificate of divorce was a legal document. You just couldn't walk in and say, I want a divorce. You had to get a certificate. Kind of like a legal thing.
Does it mean like alimony? Helping you?
No. And this certificate had to be properly served. They think it also meant that the dowry had to be returned. But if you got her dowry and you used it wisely and you made wealth off it, and if you gave her dowry, but you may not need her dowry anymore because you've invested it and made money. So, what is the cause for divorce? There's some uncleanness in her. Pretty vague. Later, rabbis are going to define this as anything she does that displeases the husband. Like burning his breakfast. Or talking to another man in public. Or she snores. Or anything. Anything. That's what the rabbis say. Jesus, in Matthew 19:9 says, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. So Jesus defines it as sexual immorality. And the Hebrew word implies sexual immorality. So, also in the time of Jesus, there was a big controversy on what this meant. There was a rabbi named Shammai, and he led a conservative faction, and they said it meant only adultery. Now Hillel, who led the liberal faction, he said that it was the duty of a man to divorce his wife if she displeased him in any way. Anyway, an interesting thing, Paul studied under Hillel.
But if she had committed adultery, wouldn't he not need a divorce because wouldn't
she'd be dead? Yeah,
so he would be a single man anyways.
Yeah. I know that came up a lot. You know, if it's adultery, she's gone. No divorce needed. Now it's optional to divorce her, unlike what Hillel said that it's mandatory. Is that it was actually optional. The man did not have to divorce her. He could divorce. He could stay with her if he overlooked whatever was going on.
What if he had an affair?
Doesn't talk about the men.
That's what I said. I know.
Double standards.
Yeah, doesn't talk about the men.
It doesn't say that women can divorce.
Because men were allowed to have concubines.
Yeah,
Oh, that's
you didn't have to divorce or marry someone else. But
okay.
Matthew 19:8. Jesus says, Moses, because of the hardness of your heart, permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. So it was not God's plan for divorce. It's still not God's plan for divorce. Now, it's not an unforgivable sin. So for anyone that is divorced, you go on with life. You live a godly life now. But it was not God's plan. Now, Hosea is an example of someone that didn't divorce his wife. And she sure had sexual immorality. And again, notice it's all about the husband divorcing the wife and not the wife divorcing the husband.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. That was society. But I would say that today that applies to both men and women. So let's go on to more of what this is talking, the more specifics of this. This is verse 2 through 4.
And if after she leaves his house, she becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her, and writes her a certificate of divorce, give it to her, and send her from his house. Or if he dies, then her first husband, who divorced her, is not allowed to marry her again after she has been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. Do not bring sin upon the land, and the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance.
Okay, so this is the specific case of this. Not to be applied to every instance of divorce, but it's about if a man divorces a woman and then she goes and marries someone else, and then that second man divorces her or dies. If it's divorce, it's like, okay, 2 strikes. I mean, first husband can't have her back. She can't go back to the first husband. Don't know how often that would happen. Well, I guess it can happen. No matter what, the first couple can't be back together because she has been with a different man in between. And God feels extra strong about this. He says it's an abomination. Super strong about it. He wants marriage to be seen as a permanent thing, not a temporary thing, not divorce because you crossed your eyes wrong at me today, or one person said it's because marriage is a God-made thing, divorce is a man-made thing. And it doesn't change the union in God's eyes unless she marries someone else, because then she's made a vow with someone else. And again, cultures around them were divorcing and remarrying all over the place. And they were taking marriage lightly.
You have to put it into context of who he's speaking to.
Yeah.
Again, we think it's, oh my gosh, how could he be so judgmental? Look at the context. Look at how everyone was around them.
Yeah.
And now you see why he had to put this stuff the way it is.
Yeah. He has to, for him to talk about this specific situation, it had to be something that was happening. Or danger of happening. And God says, don't let this happen. So, marriage was to be sacred. It's still to be sacred. And a lot of their marriages, sometimes they married for love, a lot of times they married for financial gain. There wasn't love to it. God still wanted that marriage to be sacred. He still wants marriage to be sacred.
What happened to like the custody of the kids in a divorce situation?
Oh,
We never see that. I would imagine if there's a, well, I don't know. We see examples of different things happening with elder sons disowned and
That would be
It doesn't-
interesting.
yeah. Because my first thought was, well, if you have a firstborn son, he's your firstborn son. That's what the Bible says.
Yeah.
I mean, we saw an example of that. That firstborn son is always your firstborn son. No one else can take his place. But
right.
we don't see anything about custody or.
Because it'd be interesting in a situation like that, would the kids stay with the mother or stay with the father?
Doesn't say.
That would be interesting.
Yeah.
I'm sure society-wise, though, like the women were the caretakers, so you'd
Yeah.
imagine that the wife would probably, because it says later or earlier that like the men have to take care of the wife,
Yeah.
even if it's like they marry on later on, they still have to take care of the first wife. So that's what I would imagine.
Yeah, it'd be interesting.
Okay, let's look at a pleasant thing for once. Verse 5.
When a man takes a new wife, he shall not go out with the army, nor be charged with any duty. He shall be free at home 1 year, and shall give happiness to his wife whom he has taken.
Isn't that's a nice verse. Bonding in a marriage was very important. The other thing about a marriage is they were supposed to be having kids.
Oh.
And if he goes out to war the first year and dies, no kids. So, but the stress is on making the wife happy. But there's also the kid thing. And making the wife happy, yeah, implies giving her a baby. And he's to make her happy for a full year, and then go off to war.
Maybe ought to read that at a wedding.
Yeah.
Second part of that verse.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. He shall be free at home 1 year to be happy with his wife. Yeah.
Good all Roger.
So Proverbs 27:15 says, "A happy well, these are verses about a happy wife is a happy life, but a miserable one." First Proverbs 27:15 says, "A continual dripping on a rainy day and a contentious woman are alike. Better to dwell in the corner of a housetop than in a house shared with a contentious woman," from Proverbs 21:9. Better to dwell in the wilderness than with a contentious and angry woman, Proverbs 21:19. So you wanted to make your wife happy. It also talks about or be liable to public or liable for other public duty, pretty much meaning any job that would take up his time, make him travel for a full year. He was to concentrate on wife and family.
It does make a difference in the marriage. It really does.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a bonding time. I mean, nowadays we give, forgot what it's called, the time with a parent for their child for bonding. Leave.
Family home, family leave.
Family leave, yeah. We give that to husbands. And so this was family leave for a man to bond with his wife. So
A year, that's a long time.
yeah. Hopefully by then they have some babies.
Yeah.
But then, according to these previous verses, they have to stay for 1 year and then divorce each other.
Oh, this is a whole different thing than divorce. So the earlier verses were, don't. You think they'd have to stay together for a year, but they, don't push them together. They were separate issues. That was just a circumstance, and now this is a new one. These are all just various laws put together so that they can form their country and do it God's way. Okay, verse 6.
Do not take a pair of millstones, not even the upper one, as security for a debt, because that would be taking a man's livelihood as security.
Okay, so if you gave someone a loan, you know you're not supposed to charge interest, but you could have
Collateral.
yeah, collateral. So it's saying don't take collateral that will make it a hardship on someone, make it where they can't live. So a millstone was made up of two pieces of rock, one resting on the lower, and it was vertical, no, whatever, it was that way, horizontal. And it could weigh up to 100 pounds. The upper stone was horizontal, and it weighed about 5 pounds, and it would roll around on the lower one. You wouldn't, it was interesting, yours said either millstone. You wouldn't want to take the bottom one because it could weigh up to 100 pounds. You don't want to lug that thing around. But the one that weighs 5 pounds, yeah, you might want to take that as a pledge. But God says, don't. Because if you don't have that upper stone, that person's not able to grind their grain, and they can't make their bread, which they need to use to eat. So don't take something from someone that is going to make it where they can't live. The concept of it is God didn't want anyone taking advantage of the poor. Never interest, but collateral is okay. But it had to be non-essential items only. And then we'll see about other things in it too a little later. Verse 7 says, if a man is found stealing one of his brothers of the people of Israel, and if he treats him as a slave or sells him, then the thief shall die. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. So kidnapping was pretty common around where they lived. You'd kidnap someone and sell them as a slave. Human trafficking.
Wow.
They had human trafficking back there. We know when they had the African slave trade, that's what happened. They kidnapped and sold. Human trafficking.
Oh, no.
Yeah, but they have it back then. It's a sin that has been around.
Doesn't do anything new, just sold things.
Yeah, and they weren't kidnapping for ransom, because no one paid that kind of pay. It wasn't worth it. They were kidnapping them to sell them or enslave them. And God says, do not do that to your fellow Hebrew. Never do that to your fellow Hebrew. If you're caught doing it, you die. Because in essence, you have taken a life. So you give your life. You've robbed God of a precious possession, a human life. Serious, serious crime. So you die.
It just goes to show when people say, oh, well, that wasn't around in Bible times. Everything that has happened and has happened during the time the Bible was written.
Yeah.
There's nothing new.
Yeah. And the great thing is God is regulating this. Everybody else around, no regulations. So it's just happening.
That's where that saying comes from, nothing new under the sun.
Yeah, I was just thinking that.
Yeah.
Solomon wrote it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's horrible that it happens now. It was horrible that it happened then.
Yeah.
So it's sin. So, and sin has been
Just
around.
now, even more because of this technology, I guess.
Well,
And more people.
now we hear about it more
Yes.
because
Yeah.
it's everywhere, but
Mm-hmm.
it has been around.
Yeah, I was reading something that statistically, annually, human trafficking is a multi-billion-dollar company, they will make more money than like Burger King in a year.
Yeah.
Or McDonald's in a year. And it's rampant worldwide. The industry as a whole will make more money.
Well, and I'd read a report that from several years ago that the gangs in LA, they're not so much into selling the drugs anymore. They do, but the human trafficking is better because once you sell the drugs, it's used. But the human trafficking, if you have someone to sell, you can sell them over and over and over again. So, yeah, it's not. It's a bad thing, and God is telling them you do not do that. He still doesn't want us to do that, of course, but it's unfortunately our world today, and it was their world then too. Okay, another subject, verse 8 and 9. Yep.
Oh boy. Okay.
Yeah, we're back to unpleasant things.
Take heed in an outbreak of leprosy that you carefully observe and do according to all that the priests, the Levites, shall teach you, just as I commanded them, so you shall be careful to do. Remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam on the way when you came out of Egypt.
Okay, we've seen a lot of detail about leprosy. And again, this leprosy is not necessarily the kind of leprosy we see today, or maybe even in the New Testament. It was any kind of skin disease. But notice one phrase gets repeated 3 times in here. Take care. Be careful. It's in there again. Shall be careful to do. How careful does God want them to be?
Very, very careful.
It was such a dreaded disease. God wants them to take immediate action when they see an outbreak of leprosy. Again, this is a God sanitary thing. The other cultures around them were not doing this, but they were. God was protecting his people. And then Miriam is held out as an example. Remember, she had rebelled against Moses, and her punishment was that God made her a leper, and she had to be quarantined. So he's saying, just as she was quarantined, if you have a leper, quarantine them. Miriam's used as an example because she was one of the leaders of the country. So it's saying no one is exempt. Anyone. If Moses came out with leprosy, he would have to be quarantined. It didn't matter who it was. Quarantine them. Kind of like COVID should have been. Anyone, didn't matter if it was the president, quarantine.
I can remember when I was very young, if somebody was sick in the neighborhood, the sign went on their door, and nobody went to their house, except if they handed through the door or whatever.
Really?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, in
Yeah.
the military, they used to have their own commode. If you were sick, you were only allowed to use this specific one.
Yeah.
They didn't want spread to the other soldiers.
Time kind of got away from me. It is time to stop.
Oh,
We didn't quite make it through. It just, yeah, time flies when you're talking about excrement. And okay, so I'm going to turn this off. Bye, everybody. Bye, Wanda.